Hey everybody, welcome. So today we're talking all about the mixed voice technique, what the heck that is. Please feel free to ask questions. As always, this is one that anyone can do, but ultimately it's really helpful if you have a sense of chest voice and head voice before you start, as we're going to be using a lot of the skills that you build up through your regular practice to understand how to find your mix. But it's also something that you can just do by imitation a lot of the time. So I think it's really important. We'll talk a little bit about what the mix means and the problem with language when we try to explain these sort of complicated systems with our voice. So yeah, please stop me if you have questions. But let's get started. We'll definitely do some exercises and things, and then talk about maybe some like barriers and issues that people come across when they're working through their mix. And then, of course, the mix is like an umbrella term for a number of different options that you can have. We'll talk about sort of like how to apply your mix and what that means, and what sort of needs it more than others, what sort of genres, and then just ways that you sing, and in terms of how you can use your mix to find a healthier way of doing certain things in certain situations. So the first thing that we want to talk about is like I think the way that we try to define this stuff can really throw people for a loop. Um, so we talk about like chest voice is like our speech voice function, and head voice being this, or falsetto, right? If you use that term, being a way that the larynx protects itself by reducing some pressure and using higher formants when we go up into a higher area of our voice. And then there's often this area where we have transition, and when we don't transition well, our voice cracks or it gets kind of stuck, sort of stalls out. I like to use the sort of car analogy of changing gears. Um, and mixed voice, yes, of course. I think this is mixed voice is one of those things that needs to be covered many times, and it's something that you ultimately need to be pretty patient about when you're exploring your voice. Um, Now, the problem is when you think about it in terms of like chest voice and head voice, chest voice being the bottom of your register and head voice being the top register of your voice. Mixed voice is naturally like the middle of our voice, or that's like a way that you can start to think about it. Um, but what's the issue is when people think of it as like a distinct or um, different function from everything else that you're doing with your voice. Like it's like a different um, like technique altogether. And it certainly like has a distinct kind of sound when you're mixing appropriately. But another way we could think about this is just advanced singing is like what I like to talk about, because registers are often defined by uh, the dysfunction. So that cracking or that situation where we don't have a smooth transition. And then we start to have problems. We feel a clear separation between our speech voice and our much higher sort of sung head voice kind of sound. So another way that you want to maybe reframe this is to not get stuck in that sort of duality, but instead to think about the different variables that we have with our voice. And when we have different combinations of these variables, we get different effects, and we can have different strategies to achieve certain notes. So, like, especially around the middle of our range, we have all these different options. And so that's why this can be a really, really confusing thing to explain to people. Think of it like we have our breath pressure, right? So we have support from our lower abdominal muscles. That's one variable. Um, that's important when we need stability underneath our vocal folds. So if you don't have good breath pressure, the air escapes, right? We start to squeeze. We do all these things where our head and our neck comes out, and the muscles start to lock, and it becomes more rigid. Our body's trying to hold the air there. And so that's where we can get a lot of tension problems. Um, and that's one variable. The other variable is chord compression stuff. And so we'll talk about how the two chest and head voice registers can kind of help us, or can help balance each other out. When we're talking about chord compression, we're talking about something that's kind of hard to consciously control. You have to get a feeling for it and then do certain things that coax your muscles in the right place. But it's essentially about different combinations of sort of ways that the larynx can, the vocal folds can come together. So we have like thicker vocal fold connection. We have thinner vocal fold connection. Yeah, we're gonna get to some siren slides. I can see what you're doing there. That's part of this, and we'll talk about vowels as well because that's really important. But one of them is chord compression stuff. So how the vocal folds are coming together, how much surface area is there, and all of that kind of stuff. We call it sort of like laryngeal configuration, which is like a fancy term for that. Um, that's another variable. That one's a little harder to do because we don't really consciously control those muscles very much. It's more indirect. Um, then the next sort of variable is acoustical phenomenon, vowel shapes, formants, all of these other things that happen in our vocal tract as we get the right kinds of shapes. Um, yeah, definitely. We're definitely going to talk a little bit about twang and nasality a little more too, because I think that's super important. So all of these things, like these variables are interacting to create the pitch that we have, and then the last variable that people like to talk about is our perception of what our voice is doing, what it feels like, what the sound quality is like. You can get similar kinds of sounds that are almost impossible to distinguish the difference with different strategies. And that's really what we're talking about with mixed voice. If you're just carrying the weight up of your chest voice and getting more and more shouty, essentially what's happening is your vocal folds are thickening and they're pressing harder together. There's more breath pressure. And then this area starts to contract. And eventually it's going to lead to voice breaking or tension issues. And it takes a lot of energy. So we call that like carrying the weight up. When we learn to mix, we learn to use other strategies besides just breath pressure. And we are able to get a weird balance of forces that gives us a similarly resonant and powerful sound, but it's kind of like a magic trick. So that's where mixed voice comes into play here. Think of it more like a balancing of these different variables. That's why when I'm trying to teach the voice, I try to think of these different aspects of the voice and work them a little bit independently as much as possible. It's all connected, so that I can start to toggle these different forces until I get my desired pitch, timbre, power, all of these kinds of things. So, we're going to get into sort of like what is our light mix and what is our belt mix and how do we use twang and all of that kind of stuff. But it really comes down to an understanding of these different categories of the voice. So, ultimately, the first thing that we want to do is condition our chest voice, get comfortable with chest voice, um, condition your head voice, get comfortable with that register as well, and learn sort of what the trade-offs of each register are, and try to get the opposite in the sound. So I talked about a little bit about this last week about chest voice. If you just keep sort of leaning into this sort of shouty sound, it gets bigger and brassier, but it comes at a cost. And the best thing you can do is actually start to release some of the chord compression or pressure as you sing your chest voice stuff. So we're trying to find a breathier, more relaxed tone in chest voice. Now in head voice, it's the opposite issue. The body's trying to protect itself by releasing the chord compression a little bit. We get that kind of breathy head voice sound. But that kind of backfires too because it doesn't create enough sound for us sometimes. So we end up actually pushing and squeezing, and the same thing happens again. That sort of tension, but it's for a different reason, which again is just confusing about this. So in head voice, we're trying to get a more solid sound, not by pressing, but using resonance and this sort of back pressure inertance thing, and trying to coax in more chord compression. When we can do these two things, we have a better handoff between our two registers, and thus we have mixed voice. So another way we can explain this is like, right, that thick vocal fold, chest voice, vocal folds are thicker. So we go up into head voice, it's thinner. What is mixed but just our ability to get everything in between and get that really smooth realignment of resonance, using our breath pressure to manage and negotiate things. But it doesn't mean that like just the higher we go, the more and more we press and push into our support. It's actually more subtle than that. And different people are going to need different things. So this is why we're talking about how you find your mix, because it's something that you're going to have to explore in your own voice and with your own because we have different voice types, and so there's different strategies that different voice types are going to use more often, which is going to give them a trade-off, right, between like what's easier or harder with their mix, with the jumping registers and everything else. So um, that's sort of the first thing. Now, when we get into actually the practice, right, it can seem like ridiculously simple. Oh, I'm just practicing moving from chest voice to head voice, and I'm using vowel shapes to help me understand how the resonance, sort of these tiers of overtones, how I use different ones to stabilize as I go up from lower chest voice up into head voice. Um, it can seem like a really obviously simple thing, right? Like just like someone put here like the IE, right? Going like "Ah." I'm sliding between my two registers and trying to get a smooth transition and smoothing out that break range. Now my breath pressure as I'm doing something like that, it starts to engage, keeps my body stable as the pitch is rising. And then I get to this point where it starts to switch and my vocal folds are starting to change. And I actually have to come off of the pressure a little bit and then start to change the shape of the vocal tract. I'm using A to E because you can feel a really obvious change. Now, it's not A to E like this, like it's not quite that, although we can use some of this for later. So again, uh, well, everything is sort of interconnected, but try to see if you can keep everything a little more neutral and try not to let your head and your neck come out. You can put your hand behind your head, move your head from side to side as you do this. Analogies I like to use are like, imagine you're driving around a curve. And so as you're going into the curve, you accelerate a little bit to get some momentum. Then you step off the gas, right? We all do this a little bit intuitively with our foot pedal. We have to learn how to do this with our voice when we're learning our mix, essentially. We come off the gas, we coast for a sec, we change shape a little bit, we reorient, and then we step back on the gas again. So as you're doing this, this is this game. Now, what you're talking about here, when the higher you go, there's more air flowing out, right? That's a chord compression thing. So we're going to talk about, particularly working your head voice is really important in this situation because chest voice is typically a lot of people use that to speak already. So it's a little more natural feeling. What you're going to want to do is this concept of conditioning each register sort of separately, is you're going to want to do those things that create chord compression, right? So that's like a G sound, G, K, a K sound, an NG is a little more of a continuous kind of glottal, just gives you sort of like somewhere the best of both worlds. That's why I really like using NG sounds a lot of the time. So you're going to want to do things where you're feeling that. Now, it's not the G itself that creates the chord compression. It's kind of what happens right before you create that sound as your vocal folds come together. So it's this thing. If I'm up in head voice, I'm doing my like, g, g. Do you see how everything kind of builds up pressure, right, and holds a little bit? So we're just trying to coax that in. We don't want to over engage this, but just the concept of using a G is going to start to train those muscles. So another way people will do this sometimes, and I don't like to practice holding my breath too much when I'm singing because you always want to keep your air flowing. But you can feel this when you take in a breath and hold it for a second. You feel that it's not just your vocal support muscles that are keeping your air down and pressurized. It's also your vocal folds have to come together. And so it's sealing the air that way. And so what happens is like, if you take a breath and you hold it for a second, then let it go, you'll feel that release. And then so sometimes taking a double breath, you can really feel this. And it can be a great way to set up for head voice if you're having trouble with that. So I'll take a breath and take another breath and then do the or sometimes people will do like the cuckoo clock, right? Like cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Or sometimes I'll do this one where I go like sing freely. So what I'm trying to do is I'm like using these concepts of the consonants to sort of coax my muscles that way, almost like a bolster effect, right? Like in yoga, where you have something that kind of keeps you in the right position. And then I try to take that away and just try to maintain it without actually having that stuff there. Because we don't always have those sounds to coax us that way. When we do, it's helpful. But in this case, when I'm going like, I'm like setting it up and then seeing if I can keep my vocal folds together. Subtle feeling, right? You have to just experiment with this because, again, we don't really consciously control these chord compression muscles, but you can hear it when you have bad chord compression. If it's like, sing free, and you start squeezing and it sounds kind of whistly, that's a chord compression thing. Sometimes we like that sound, right? It just depends on how much, and it's a variable we have to control. So head voice tends to have poor chord compression. Chest voice tends to have too much of that buildup of pressure. So in chest voice, we're trying to get the opposite thing, this feeling of that like, ooh, ah, ah. So sometimes, like when I was talking about the light mix in the last sort of contemporary thing, I was taking some head voice, trying to pull it down into chest voice, going like, ooh, ah, ah. And then I kind of come off my voice for a sec and see if I can just sit right in that position. Be like, ooh, ah, ah, ah. This very light, sort of breathy sound is going to be really, really helpful. In general, when we spread out a vowel like this, we tend to squeeze and collapse in the back. And that sometimes will cause more of that sort of chord compression, but not in a healthy way. So what we do actually is we try to get a rounder sound in our chest voice. So a little bit of lip action, and that causes the resonance to start to kind of spin around. And then that causes the vocal folds to stay more stable or together without us having to squeeze them. So it's this weird kind of like jujitsu that you kind of have to do with your voice. We want to practice getting a really nice, relaxed chest voice up in our kind of like middle to higher register there. And then the zone of that register, like middle to higher part of our chest voice. And then in head voice, we're trying to get actually more chord compression on the lower end. I mean, yes, on the top two, if you want to be able to sing into head voice, but when you're working on your mixing, you particularly want to get a more full sound down wherever that your break range is actually. So a lot of this sliding around is not just about going from the very bottom to the top, but it's mostly about what happens right in the middle, right? So that's why it's like mixed voice range is kind of thinking of the overlap between the two. So when we're doing like ah to E, I'm trying to relax my chord compression as my chest voice goes up. And then I'm trying to get a little more chord compression as it goes into head voice. So it takes a second, and it takes kind of training the registers a little bit separately at first, I think is a good way of teaching. So think about it like vocal registers are like a teaching metaphor. It's more actually about these variables, and that's what gives us all of these actual like cool options in between and the actual flexibility in our voice. So if you're thinking like just chest and head voice, that eventually is going to be a little limiting. Sometimes we want abrupt registration, so we can use all of these things. We just have to understand what happens when we take the weight of chest voice up and we go, ah, eventually it's going to squeeze or kind of crack up into a higher register. And the same thing happens sometimes when we try to press on our low head voice, right? We go like, and it kind of slips into this other thing, right? We can use cracking to our advantage, right? Thus, contemporary singing does this all the time, like, yeah, oh, right? We kind of like, oh, hey, ooh, right? All of that kind of stuff happens, and it can be a really useful sort of dramatic element. It's not necessarily bad for the voice. It's the way that the voice is trying to abruptly switch into a safer mode. So when we start to understand this about the limits of our two registers, we can learn to negotiate them better. So let's go through some practices, and please again stop me, ask questions whenever you're having issues, and when we'll troubleshoot things. You want to pay attention to these variables. Like, can I tweak my vowel shape a little bit? Am I building up? Am I trying to support the sound by like squeezing my tongue, and therefore it's getting kind of rigid? Am I over supporting and over pressurizing it? Do I need to kind of lean off of it? Hey, welcome. Yeah. Always great to see some familiar names. And yeah, if you're just coming into things, you can always come back and look at the beginning where I kind of like set up the system that we're working with. So I try to have a similar kind of strategy here. So the concept again here is that mixing is really just advanced singing, and there's lots of different options, and it's understanding how to balance these different variables that make the voice function efficiently. So if, in my sort of practice, if I can find better balance and a more efficient way of doing something, I'm definitely going to do it that way. Unless I really need something for certain sort of dramatic output. But it's always sort of this wizardry, right, of trying to figure out like the smoothest way to do something while still having the same effect externally to people. Um, so let's do a little bit of this concept. So one way that I do this, right, is just the simple slides going from ah to e. Eventually, you can do this with just each individual vowel. So I recommend doing that too, just going like E. And you'll notice that certain registers or certain areas of the voice, like a fourth or fifth, they'll want to get kind of stuck like that. So why slides and sirens are so helpful is it's keeping you flexible and moving so you don't get kind of locked in position. A lot of times in a song that happens, we get kind of stuck in a certain zone and then our voice has trouble stretching and transitioning. So that's why I'm doing this sort of like to keep it really flexible. You'll notice that certain vowels will transition in different places. So as you practice this, notice that maybe that like E actually switches up into head voice a little sooner, right? So if I'm like E, and then you try it with A, it's totally fine to have a crack, right? Just keep working through that and finding a smoother and smoother transition. Comes and goes from day to day. So then like an A vowel going A. So through this process, you start to see that, okay, the A goes up a little bit higher before I can find a really smooth transition. And then ah, and the ahs actually you have to be really careful with on the other side because it can go up pretty high in chest voice, but then the chord compression gets more and more, and then we're more likely to get too megaphony and get kind of stuck in chest voice. So ah, you have to understand sort of how each vowel sort of works in either direction. Also know that sirens are like kind of much harder than what we normally have to do. And a lot of times we can, when we're, even if it's like your transition isn't perfectly smooth, tiny little crack, that's totally fine. A lot of times in like the breaks between words, we're resetting and reformulating our shape and breath pressure. And so we have these little moments where we can actually kind of hide the transitions, sometimes between consonants, things like that. But this just helps us understand and feel that sort of racetrack that we have to move along. So do that with different vowels. Ah to E is a great way to go from very smoothly from chest to head voice. And then eventually you can find like sort of these neutral vowels like and you'll realize that these tiny little micro adjustments. So we're talking kind of about like vowel modification, how the vowel shape feels a little different in different places. You have to just sort of explore that. The next thing that I like to do is with this in mind, this is how I kind of formulate exercises to help coax my voice. So I do this one where it starts in chest voice and it goes like, you've heard it before, but it's moving around, staying pretty flexible. You can do this kind of with individual notes, or you can kind of make it a little more slidey depending on what you're feeling. And I start with just a regular chest voice, kind of speech voice, like ah, right? And I'm going like na 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 na, whatever. Just make it very natural, normal. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. So you're gonna find more brightness, sort of more maskiness, maybe some buzz in the chest. So na 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 na. You'll feel your support start to engage more. And then I can do a different strategy. I don't have to just keep adding more and more support. I can start to modify the vowel. So now take that pattern and I'm going to make it a no, right? And be like, no, 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 no. Now you notice all of a sudden the overtone starts to kind of sit in a different place. Everything kind of gets lighter. It's like a gear shift in a car, right? You're riding up and then different amount of chord compression, different amount of pressure, acoustical sort of phenomenon, and I can maintain a higher pitch with kind of the same amount of breath pressure as what I did before, but because I changed a different variable, right? So you're gonna have to do this particular to whatever your range is. So that's actually a good way of figuring out what your range is where these transitions occur. So just explore it and like make funny sounds. Again, like the best way to find your mix is to make some funny sounds, but pay attention to how you feel. Don't overextend yourself. Like, you can always do this from like a delicate sort of dynamic. And what's cool is when you change these variables, you're able to keep your dynamic or your like volume of your voice kind of in a similar place the entire time. Keep it in the middle. Don't go too loud. Don't go too soft quite yet. So again, I'm doing this kind of na thing, and then I go into to the no. And sometimes I like to use harmonics to kind of help myself. So I'll change the chord a little bit. So first I just do like this typical kind of like na 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 na. Then as I go up higher, I just kind of change the pattern a little bit on the bottom. So this is just for you music nerds out there. But I'll take like let's think about this. If I go like so I'm going like I'm using this same actual notes, but it's just stacked differently. But it's a lighter, more ethereal sound, so it helps me kind of match it. And I go like na no na no na no. Now, as we go softer, sometimes we want to feel like we let go of our breath. Keep your breath low. It doesn't have to be like pressing or pushing too hard. Just keep it low. No, no. Okay. So maybe perhaps if you're talking about your mixed voice in this case, you might be because it's going more chest dominant, right? If you're maybe going a little more belty, we'll talk about this. Sort of some troubleshooting. Sometimes in the process of finding these things, our body tries to compensate in lots of weird different ways. If you're having trouble getting into head voice, it might be because you are like there's maybe some extra tongue or jaw tension, and it's making it so that it's getting kind of stuck in that position. And then it also might have to do with too much sort of ultimately like pressure on the vocal folds, right? So thinking about that sort of softer, lighter mix is an easier way to access into head voice. But this is also, it comes with the territory, right? If you're belting a lot, it can get you kind of stuck with that with your muscles. So you have to be careful about it. Try to pull your volume back, use more resonance tricks like this. So again, I'm down low, just doing this like na 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 na. It can be kind of bright, whatever. But then when I'm doing this in this sort of different register, let's do it a little bit lower for everyone. So it'll be like here, like na 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 na. Oh. Remember, you can do this as a slide thing, so that I'm doing kind of like the more like specific notes, but it could be like na no na no na no. So I'm not trying to get too loud or too shouty. I'm trying to keep my lips actually a little more draped and round, and that's going to give me a little bit more ability to sort of stretch and relax here. So you could think of there's always kind of some vowel modification going on. This is why I like to use glides a lot of the time. So there's kind of a whoa in there. Even when I'm going like na no na no na no. And if you're finding you're getting really harsh up there, borrow in some head voice and go like ooh, you can also think of just like an H sound, like the air moving through a little bit more. But make sure that you're when you're doing this and you're releasing the chord compression, that you don't start to do one of these other things to compensate, right? So you have to be careful of your head and your neck and be like, once you get really good at that, you can actually just be like, I am talking up in this high part of my range. But it's like chest voice, or is it head voice, right? It starts to become a very, very light, smooth transition. So again, we go from ah to o, and then as we keep going, now I kind of like to switch the pattern a little bit. It's still this, but I'm using actually more of like a major seven sound. So it's like let's do it like here. Actually, not that. So it'll be like this. Nani, 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 so now I'm going from the to the e. Now notice I'm doing kind of like the entire time, because the neutral vowel is kind of our trick to sort of negotiating between all these different vowel shapes. That's why you'll see a lot of people when they talk about mixed voice using like kind of like rounding over your as you're sliding up in your sirens. Here I'm just trying to make it a little more obvious. So again, nani. I'm going from chest to head voice. Nani, 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 ya. And that yaw is a nice way to sort of retransition the resonance. And just pay attention to what your body's doing. It's going to make all these subtle little micro adjustments. Vocal support's also kind of largely an unconscious process when we're singing. Unfortunately, it's you don't want to be thinking about like pumping this system so much, but I do, when I'm singing, like think about, okay, I'm feeling ungrounded and I'm noticing things starting to strain, so I need to breathe into my belly and feel a little more of that kind of leaning sensation, just until I get the resonance and stability back in my voice. So this is going to feel really light, right? We need that sort of lighter mix. So again, I'm going from ah, like na 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 na, to this sort of like na 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 na, or the ah, a little more chest voice still, and then eventually I'm switching into this chest to head voice feeling. Nani, nani, nani. It's that middle point that's actually the most important. Again, you can slide around like this. You'd be like, just pay attention to any tension things, right? The tongue tends to be one of the sort of, I call it the gatekeeper of our resonance, because it's the major mover of our vowel shapes. So if you're feeling like a lot of tension here, or it's really pressing forward, that can make it really hard to get back into your light mix. So twang can backfire. We'll talk about twang because that's what we're going to be using a lot when we do the more belty kind of sound. But just remember that we don't want to like follow the character of our voice too much. Yeah, we were acting and performing and stuff, but like when it sounds and feels more intense, sometimes we want to like grip down and bear down, and you actually have to do the exact opposite. You kind of have to float with it. So don't fool yourself when you're building momentum energetically with resonance and stuff by like trying to like bear down on it, because that's where you're going to start to get a lot of extra pushing and squeezing. No, with candy in my mouth. Are you talking about like putting something on your tongue? Sometimes people will do that just to see and feel out how the tongue is moving. With that, I'd be careful with any of these like big registration moves. I usually just practice moving my lips and isolating if I have something on my mouth. Oh, yeah, happy Halloween, everyone. It's coming up really soon. But yeah, it's actually kind of funny. There's not a lot of good I mean, challenge me if you think I'm wrong here. There's not like a lot of vocal stuff with Halloween. It tends to be a little more instrumental, because you tend to get that's just sort of like the spooky sound. I mean, there's like songs that are thematically sort of like about Halloween stuff, but you'll notice that there's like maybe it could be more stuff written that's more on that sort of line of things. But yeah, anyways, I'm always trying to find like good like Halloween themed music. I mean, there's all like the Nightmare Before Christmas stuff, and there's some great sort of like old school things. But there's actually tends to be a little more of that instrumental thing. at some point, that could be like a fun thing. It's like what makes music sound like certain seasons. A lot of time, there's some theory behind that too. But yes, anyways, yeah, don't practice this while you're eating candy. Especially candy is not sometimes the best for the voice because it's like a sugar intensity kind of causes like a lot of mucus and some other things. Uh, anyways, yes, so you can practice trying to relax your tongue by putting actually like a piece of candy or something right there. Use probably like an almond or something. And I'm just practicing my ability to round over without changing this shape. That's going to be really helpful when we're practicing sort of this cover thing and using our lips. The fine tuners of our vowel shapes, they make a big difference. So this is a just for troubleshooting. If you're finding like you've got a really rigid tongue and you're putting your thumb under here, it's really locking in place. That's going to make you crack more often. It's also going to make it hard to get into head voice. As your voice gets more and more tired, you're often going to notice it in your head voice a lot of the time. It just starts to like too much the chord compression gets all out of whack, right? Because it's bruised a lot of the time, right? So it's kind of like puffy. So what you can do is something like practice the isolation of moving your lips. You could put something right here and just try to not let it go like pull back, right? That's one thing that'll happen. And then some people it's hey, kind of locking up and in like that. It's just gonna make it less possible for you to negotiate this space. So that's why like tension habits are so important to work through, and they're often that's actually the barrier in your mixed voice range is the tongue tension and all these other things. That's why I'm so careful in my practice to try and make sure that I relax all these things. I'm like, and I can hear that consistent resonance. So when I do stuff where I'm like, no, 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 no. It doesn't go like no, no, no. I get kind of stuck. So no, and then you're gonna realize that you can actually sing it much softer, right? So this is always this issue. When in doubt, if you're over chord compressing, go practice your head voice a little bit more and bring it back, right? So that's why we do these ones where we descend down from head voice. A great one that I like to do for the light mixing is this one. So going like the goal is kind of the coming back part to the ah. So also if you're really hard with your oo, you get stuck, right? But you can start to kind of feel yourself get a little more narrow actually in your placement. The more it comes out like this, sometimes the harder it is to pull it back. So that's why belting and doing that kind of stuff, I kind of save it for the end because it's the most likely to kind of get you out of whack a lot of the time. The more we add in chest voice, the more we trend towards shouting. So that's kind of one of the most common issues people will have. So I'm always a little wary of a voice teacher who immediately throws someone into belt practice because you might just be training a bad habit and not really understanding the mechanism and the variables. So again, I really like this sort of sliding one. There's one part that I missed, which was when I think of more of the belt mix, I'm using more of like my na a, like an a, something a little more neutral in the middle. You might practice this first more head voice dominant and then try to lean in more and more chest voice. With this one, I like to do kind of a more dominant sound. I go like na 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 na. Start like that. It's it is head voice. Na na, and then I just kind of sneak it in a little more, like na 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 na. One great way of doing this is it's more of our perception thing, but I think I'm gonna talk it a little more, but I'm gonna keep the position of And the second you do that, you're going to notice maybe your support kicks in. Things are going to want to pop out. Try to keep that same alignment, and then try to slide it, going like. Oftentimes, you'll find it more on the way back. That feeling of everything kind of staying a little pressurized and connected. And these are just, again, ways to start to find it. Um, Eventually, you can start to kind of dig into that more and more. But I recommend starting with the light mix first. Yeah, did you feel it a little bit? That's good. So it's just like a way we're using vowels in the natural sort of path of least resistance is a way that I try to coax my voice into it in a healthy way. Um, Watching for these sort of tension habits, and doing these kinds of practices, right? So you might find that you need to make sure your head voice is able to open up to A and ah, which is a little harder with chord compression. So you might have to go back and work your head voice a little bit and be like, and then the ah is going to feel like it's very high up and not how we normally feel it. Like head voice is a very different sensation, but that's the most foreign when we're in that sort of ah shape for a lot of people because it's more of a thing we feel in chest voice a lot of the time. So going, so you can get that feeling. So then when we are doing this, like na 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 na, now is where we can add twang stuff. So the difference between twang and nasality is it's a complicated sort of thing. Like as we engage our tongue and push it forward, it creates more nasality. Nasality is essentially the more we close off the sort of back placement, and we start to seal it off. We get this like you can feel it if you just think of angling into your nose a little more and narrowing the space, or collapsing this ends, things like that create nasality. So right, basically anytime we're doing a consonant shape, we're going to have a little more nasality because if my mouth is closed in an M, that's the only space that's open, right? I don't know if you've ever tried this, you'll pop your ears if you're not careful about it, but if you go like that's why our sinuses matter, right? Like if this is all blocked up, you can't really do consonants very well because it's the space gets over pressurized. So there has to be some opening. So when I'm doing this, I'm actually kind of working a lot of that twang dimension because I'm moving my tongue forward and back and up and down and feeling that sort of buzz here. Now the point is that like if you completely seal it off, it's usually too tight and it's not a sound that we like. But if you can get just the right kind of boost of that sort of narrowing of the space, you can kind of change and alter the chord compression a little bit. So this is where like the whining kind of these other sounds kind of come into place. Whenever we're doing twang, you can always just feel it by thinking like nya, like an N and an E because it's a high tongue, and then the N sound. So if you're like nya, 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 that boost of twang is really helpful. It creates that a good amount of back pressure. You just have to be careful that you don't follow with this part or you really completely seal it off. So when I think of like nasality in a negative way, it's when there's none of this space open in the back and it's completely completely in this way. Sometimes that's actually a really great sound in certain situations. So again, I'm not saying it's like terrible. You just have to be careful. And you can feel it again when you plug your nose a lot of the time, with your vowel shapes. If you're like, if I do it without any nasality, this isn't going to change very much. But if I'm, you're going to feel it more there. So again, this is all just about building your proprioception and your awareness of these different variables that play into our sound. Acoustics, breath pressure, chord compression, they all they all kind of mess with each other, or they sort of influence each other. Um, Now, if you can keep that feeling of head voice and that open, sort of tall sensation, and then also adjust this, you're going to get usually a much healthier belt. So we'll talk about that in a sec. Let's start first with just kind of feeling out, sort of moving through our registers now again. So now I kind of slow it down. So instead of just like a siren, we're doing an arpeggio, and that makes you have to sort of sustain a little longer in certain places. That's where a lot of the mixing is tricky, is when you have to sort of sustain in just the right angle. It's like you're jumping up on a fence post and you're like, I'm right here, and walking on that fence post, and then you kind of come back off of it, right? So there's like a moment of this difficulty, and if you don't catch the balance of forces, it sometimes collapses. So we do it in short little bursts, right? So you're like, why, I'm building pressure, and then when I do that wah, I can actually catch a different sort of current of overtone. Like why. Your support's going to be involved. It's important. Make sure you breathe low so it's accessible. Why, and try not to let yourself come forward. Why, and just know that every spot's gonna feel a little different, right? The difference for me between this note, why is different from why. It starts to sit a little higher. Why, and I pull off of the pressure, and I think a little more head voicey, and I see if my body starts to follow me that way. In general, it's you want to actually have less air coming out as you go up higher, and it starts to feel like it goes more narrow and more of a cover. So people will practice this just going like, with the covering rounding this way is one option. Why or one, things that kind of are keeping this moving is good. And then the yaw is we're kind of borrowing a little bit of that sort of twangy kind of sound. So I'm using these glides as a way to kind of catch these moments. So you have to be careful if you're like, why, it's a different thing. I mean, it has a certain effect to it. It's going to have a limitation. And if eventually they go too far, and it's going to maybe collapse, kind of get something like that. Or you're just going to feel a lot of sort of inflammation and things. It makes it more and more murky. So why, one, all of those kinds of things are helpful. Eventually, you can just kind of like, yeah, kind of just feel that buildup of pressure, keep it stable, and just kind of pick it out of the air. Now, this thing, when we do that why, it starts to adjust a little bit of the twang stuff. And we can actually, if you're really careful with this and your voice is flexible, and you've been conditioning it, you can start to do the wind thing. So that's where I'm going to boost the front formant, but also keep this space open here. And we start to get more like actual acoustic mixing. So it's in this process of kind of building momentum and the pressure. So we're sort of surfing a wave. Try to do it with motion before you sustain into any of these kinds of things. When we sustain, that's when we tend to have the biggest issues. Think of it like lifting a weight. Like if you're hold it and lock, that's going to be problematic. So now I'm going to go a little bit a little bit of this, a little bit of So think of W-A like N-G, and you're going to start to get a little bit of this. You'll actually start to notice that it's not that different from what some people do for their classical technique even. It's just riding the forward edge a little more. So if I'm like, that's a very loud sound, and it actually feels lighter than some of the other things. So if I'm like, think of like people do the imitation of like, this is how babies sound, and they actually boost all of this sound this way. Why can they do it, right? It's a lot of flexibility in the tissue and everything like that, and the size of the instrument. But and you can start to kind of like sit on a certain spot. That's really what's happening there. Do it in little bursts, but you can actually hit some of these crazy high notes using a different technique. The problem is just the transitioning, right? If you're like, let's say I'm singing up here, and you have to get like onto that pedal, and if you miss it, then you could really hurt yourself, right? So it's like you're like balancing in a weird way, like you might twist your ankle, right? Given an analogy. So that's really the trick, is knowing when you're gonna like switch into a new gear. But all of a sudden, people are gonna be like, yeah, right. I can switch in head voice, and then you can like do all sorts of different kinds of things, right? Build in a little more chest voice, come back and forth between the two. Yeah. So yeah, that might. Sorry if that blows out the speaker. You can eventually, when you do that right, you can actually pull back the volume. Although that one is supposed to, particularly for like what happens when you're trying to like create a really loud, intense kind of a sound. Just be really mindful of these tension habits. I try to train those reflexes out much lower in my register, because they run into problems right when you get into this area. If you do it wrong, the thing immediately compensates and locks up. So there's all sorts of funny things. Like here's another exercise, is thinking more stepwise, but doing the g kind of sound. It kind of helps with your chord compression stuff as you're transitioning. So like some people will go ga 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 ga. It's like, what is he doing? Each time it's helping my vocal folds get like a new realignment of resonance. And you'll realize a lot of times the issue people have is that smooth transition into head voice. Either it happens too early, happens too late, doesn't happen at all. So again, this like ga is very just neutral open. Ga 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 ga. I'm like actually draping it and doing like less and kind of like hovering through it, and that's like plus a little bit more breath pressure, or just negotiating that, and all of a sudden you like, can you tell where I switched? Like ga 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 ga. You'll find all these little kind of like in between zones. So again, exploring that stuff is kind of what I'm doing right now, is in some ways kind of harder than what we actually have, because when we're singing actual lines, we can make these transitions in certain moments, and you can actually be like a little particular about it. Like, I'm going to make that transition here. And sometimes the issues people have in their songs is because I'm like, oh, you're switching a little too early. Maybe try to keep your chest voice there for a little bit longer, and it'll make a smoother transition with the resonance. Try to pull back the dynamic, all sorts of things like that. So, there's like a little bit of tension, and the shape of the vowel isn't quite right. And so therefore it's losing that pressure system, and then getting unstable, and then you're starting to grip down on it. Right. Is this making sense to everyone? I know I'm like just kind of these live streams, I'm just going on and on, but there's all this really cool stuff that you can do. Like, once you're comfortable with that kind of stuff, I mean, like honestly, the more like useful thing a lot of the time is this light mix thing, where I can just be like, ah, ya, na, 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 na. It starts to feel almost like a weird little flute-like instrument, right? If I can do that, I can sing pretty efficiently in a lot of situations, and less is more. So, um, uh, yeah, I mean, we literally, this is what I always talk about. Like, being a singer is being an athlete of small muscles, and you have to condition these things over time. If you just immediately jump into this stuff, that's where you're going to run into issues. One, you might do it with the wrong technique, right? Just like if you do like weightlifting, you're doing the wrong technique, then you're going to hurt yourself, or you're going to strengthen the wrong stuff. This is where a teacher comes into play, is I can kind of work people through reps, and then be like, oh, see right there, you're doing that rep incorrectly, and you're training the wrong stuff, right? And it's literally kind of the same thing The problem is like with small muscles, we don't have good sensation of it a lot of the time. True for like a lot of athletic things, but like especially for the voice. So you have to go off of your perception and sensation, pay attention to how you feel later, do this in bursts, take breaks. Um, like I think ultimately, like you it's like I say athlete, but it's the athlete of small muscles. It doesn't take like as much energy as people would think. It's more about coordination, right? So that's why it's like training your reflexes and being present, slowing down first. And then this is why I talk about like building your technique stuff is actually more important than a lot of the fancy things because it's your ability to control the variables. And then it's like I'm not like thinking about now. I'm going into my mix mode. I mean, yeah, I'll be like, oh, this song's like a little more mixy. It's like I'm just piloting the ship and I have more control and I have more options over it. So that's why I say like mixing is kind of just like advanced singing in a lot of ways. And it takes getting to know your voice a little more and a little better. Don't just jump right into this if you're starting out, but like, you can certainly explore it in like a delicate way but like, condition your voice and it's gonna have more options for you. You're gonna be able to do it better. So, um, yeah, this is the practice, right? Like, and I think once you start to really understand how to do, um, uh, once you start doing like the mix more, you're starting to become a more advanced singer, and that's usually like a sign that you've developed your voice in a different way. What are you talking about here? Like, how does like smoking alter the voice, or what's what is your thought there? That can, like if you one thing I'll talk about is like smoke will sometimes lower or like relax the chord compression. Actually, it kind of paralyzes the vocal folds a little bit, so it'll give people like a huskier, deeper sound. So you'll notice that sometimes with some artists, like when they're have been alive longer and smoking more, if that's what they will maybe start to get that kind of more air coming through their sound. Now, also like using your voice a lot and working through it, you're going to start to get that sort of breathier sound as like an indication sometimes of vocal fatigue. It can also be how you talk if you're someone who's doing a lot of mixing all the time because you start to get more, you're playing around with how much air is coming through and things like that. So sometimes you'll get some people out like in between their sets and be like, thanks guys, thanks a lot, because they're just keeping their voice a little bit in a different way. um I don't know if that's what you're saying. Sometimes I'm just responding to a single word that someone's putting out, but that will affect your ability to have like smooth transitions sometimes too because of the irritation, right? So if it's like more puffy, bruised, things like that, more swollen, the vocal folds can't really do this, right? So that's why like when your voice is more tired, you're gonna have trouble mixing and you're gonna have trouble doing lighter and lighter chord compression and like head voice because it's just so puffy that it's like kind of too thick together the whole time. That's a sign you should just rest. Get off your voice for a bit, hydrate, do some massaging, some things to sort of like unwind the muscles. Like you'll feel it a little bit if you're working a lot. Like I've been doing some rehearsals and like getting in a new venue, new space, things like that. Like you're working on lots of music, you'll find that you start to over engage things. And like an athlete, you have to take a moment and stretch it out. So I talk about doing all these kinds of things where you go low in your voice and you do like humming and stuff to start to release and isolate the muscles again. Because when they all start firing at the same time, we can't really mix and we can't control these variables in the right way. So yeah, any other questions? Hopefully this just gives you a sense of like what's going on inside people's heads when they're singing. Sometimes some people are very technical about it. Some people are very tactile, just sort of go off of the sensation of it. And sometimes it's like, we're based on what we're hearing, we're subtly modifying our approach. This is a good way of thinking about blending with other singers, is thinking about like what your resonance strategy is and trying to match. If that's what you're going for. So, yeah. Any other questions? Um, Trying to think of what I have to double check and see what I'm doing next, but we've got a lot of good things. I think I put up one on about harmony at some point because someone had mentioned that. So we'll talk a little more about harmonizing. Um, yeah. If you'll notice, like the mixed voice technique is best when we learn it with some agility first and speed, and then you can start to practice sort of sustaining into it. But you have to find these sort of moments of and places of balance first. Otherwise, if the more you sustain, it's just like objectively more and more energy and pressure, more times that your vocal folds are flapping. So if you're in the wrong position, holding it out for a long time, that you're more likely to injure or hurt yourself. So that's that's why with belting, be lean and green with it, and then you can start to pause and see if you can kind of ride out into it a little more. Um, well, yeah, that's it for today. Hopefully that was informative. You have to explore this yourself. Start small, and always, as always, ask questions. And if you're really struggling with things like seeing a teacher, can be a really great way just to have some better awareness as to like what maybe your barrier is with your voice, and then you go from there. Right? Sometimes it's just you got arrested or you've got other things happening. Right? So yeah, good luck with that practice. And when in doubt, less is more. Right? Use other forces. If you're really struggling, figure out what forces you're primarily using and try to find a workaround. And yeah, look forward to next week. I'll be doing this for I think I have like the next 4 or 5, and then Camille's going to be back in action for another 4 or 5, and we'll be trading off more regularly. I think after that in the new year. So looking forward to it, and you're very welcome. And I'll catch y'all next time. All right, take care.